You have to say a bit more about yourself. So I think, Jonathon, you should introduce yourself a little bit more, because that seemed a bit disproportionate to me in terms of biographical information.
No, good start. I thought I might just say a little bit about my involvement in nuclear issues, because obviously I've been involved in Green Party and environment and sustainability and human rights stuff for 50 years or more. But nuclear I have stayed with for most of those 50 years. I joined the Green Party in 1974, primarily as a consequence of Die Grünen in Germany, which at that stage was beginning to make a mark on itself. And as you will recall, very tightly linked their opposition to nuclear power with their opposition to nuclear weapons. And there wasn't any question in the history of Die Grünen in Germany that these two things were in any way capable of being separated out. And that had a huge effect on the Ecology Party, as it was then back in the 1970s. And I also got very involved in the work of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which of course has stitched a really important thread of opposition to nuclear weapons and nuclear power here in the UK since that time. And basically what everybody was saying back then in the 1970s, well, I hate to be proved right in the kind of, upsetting way that we are being proved right, but honestly, everything that people were arguing back in the 1970s has kind of pretty much come true. Re-nuclear. There was some stuff we were saying back then which was largely rubbish, but anyway, that's another matter.
So, shall we begin?
Yes, so you felt called upon to write a new book about nuclear power, as we just heard through a very eloquent introduction, which was great. There are a lot of books about nuclear power.
Yes.
So why a new book?
Quite surprising in a way, because it does present itself as a slightly arcane and inaccessible subject. And so I really felt like it was time to put the human face on the story, to help people understand what actually happens to people who experience one facet or another of nuclear power, whether it's the uranium mining phase or the electricity generation phase or the waste mismanagement, I call it, phase, and also the link to nuclear weapons and the use of atomic testing, because we always hear, nuclear weapons only used twice in Japan. In fact, that's not true. They were only used twice in wartime, but there were thousands of atomic tests that were conducted on pretty much the same people that also endured the uranium mining, for example. So when you look at where the British tested in Australia, Aboriginal country, that's also where the uranium mining took place. And it's always been people of color, starting with Japan, the Marshall Islands, where the US bombed, the French Polynesia, where the French bombed. And in the United States, a little bit of a departure. So the atomic test sites is in Nevada on Western Shoshone land, unceded Western Shoshone Native American land, but they actually just bombed their own people. So all sorts of people in Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, they were all downwind of those tests, no matter what color they were. So there's a sort of long colonialist history. So I really felt like there was an opportunity to sort of go through the whole saga from beginning to end and tell stories so that people could sort of relate to it more rather than think, oh, this is something I'm not going to understand. And then the other piece that I felt really important about was the impact on animals and nature, because that's often not talked about at all. And I'd written a report in 2000 which looked at the impact on marine species from coastal nuclear power plants, and that was kind of an eye-opener. The toll was immense. And so it is also going to be, for example, at the Hinkley C plant that's being built on the Somerset coast. So as I wrote the book, I started to think, gosh, I wonder if our seeming sort of determination to throw away our tax pounds on, completely dangerous, futile, self-destructive technologies like nuclear power and nuclear weapons is driven by something greater, which is us losing touch with where we are. So that's why you will find in the book things about light pollution, for example, and clear-cutting forests and industrialization, that if we can't see the night sky and we've forgotten where we are and where we belong in the universe, do we really are we really taking care of this miraculous little blue marble that we live on, and understanding how important it was. And so that's why when you read the book, you'll find there's a sort of whole cross-section of things in there that you might think don't belong in a technical book about nuclear, because they stray off into some of these parallel arguments. Also about space. There's quite a bit about war fighting in space, which is a very real concern now, putting reactors on the moon, using nuclear-powered rockets to send people to Mars. That there's a sort of world gone mad component to all this, that we're determined to do all the wrong things, or at least the people that we've foolishly elected are determined to do all the wrong things. And so how do we set it straight? And the only way is to sort of feel it, as well as understand it.
So let's come back to the pounds bit, which you mentioned, which is the cost story, which is pretty astonishing once people get their heads around it. I suppose what is really intriguing is we have had some really seriously bad nuclear incidents. Chernobyl and Fukushima come to mind. The industry and most people, because when you read polls about what most people feel about this, tend to discount that. And they say that if you look at all the operating years of all the reactors that have been bringing non-carboniferous electrons into our grids for more than 45 years, actually the safety record of this industry is amazing. It has killed far fewer people than the fossil fuel industries have killed over those years. And there's literally no reason, when they're properly managed and you're not confronting horrendous natural disasters like tsunamis, there's no reason why we should be contemplating any more disasters of that kind at all in the future, because we've learnt all the lessons from that. And they are pretty adamant that this is a very safe industry. Forget low-level radiation, forget these disasters, because they don't really, if you compare them with what's going on elsewhere, they're not really the horrible thing that we anti-nuclear campaigners tend to make them out to be. We have a case to make still.
We do. I mean, you get called catastrophizing, but I think a catastrophe is what it sounds like. For example, there's a plan now in North Wales on the northern shore of Anglesey to bring in, they tried before to bring in full-size reactors. There's a site called Wilver. So there was a big campaign to stop bringing in full-size reactors to Wilver B. And again, it was a sort of another example, first of all, of these false promises that are made. We're going to bring in these reactors, you're going to have hundreds of jobs, it's going to be a boon to the economy. Well, guess what happened? Nothing. It all fell apart. What happened was that all sorts of land was taken over by Hitachi at the time, now owned by something called Great British Energy / Nuclear. But it was, so people gave up their land, they moved away, except one farm that held fast and didn't go, and nothing happened. So now there's another attempt to sort of prey upon this community with another go-round. It's Rolls-Royce actually this time, another go-round of promises, and if you oppose it somehow you're catastrophizing. But what I want to ask, like Llynnos Meddy is a Plaid Cymru, she's the MP there. He said, well, are you willing to risk turning Anglesey into a permanent sacrifice zone? Because that's what's at stake. The Chernobyl zone is 1,000 square miles still today. No one will be living there anytime soon. And what people don't understand about the disaster piece is that the kind of radiation that was released during Hiroshima, big burst, quick, high, dissipated. People live there today. Not that that's what happened was okay, by no means. But people live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nobody lives, well, there's a few babushkas, but nobody theoretically lives in the Chernobyl zone, or will they, because it persists for basically forever in the environment. Gets into the soil, gets into the plant life, it gets into the animal life. And that's what people don't understand. And when you look at a place like Wales, which is so dependent on farming, there are more sheep than people, all of this. And they did have a problem with sheep for years, where they couldn't take them to market because of the fallout from Chernobyl into the grass that they ate. That's not a risk worth taking. But I think that sometimes...
But the industry would say, just to hammer this point about industry propaganda, because we have to understand we're we're not really living in the world of facts when we're talking about nuclear power, as I hope everybody probably understands. There are lots of facts, but most of the debate about nuclear lives in this completely fantasy world. So if nuclear representatives were listening to what Linda just said, they would say, well, yes, of course, but our beautiful new, completely safe nuclear reactor in Wolver is absolutely not going to do a Chernobyl on the people of Anglesey or the people of Wales, because if you look at the operating record, we know how to manage nuclear reactors extremely safely, decade after decade after decade. And they would throw straight back at us, look at the operating record of Germany, for instance. Look at the operating record of France, where you've got decades of successful management of potentially lethal reactors, as you've just said, but with no major episodes whatsoever, and still contested evidence about low-level radiation.
But I think that there's too much focus on who died. And I do address that in this book as well. I'll see if I can find that section, because I have a little bit of a dig at George Monbiot, amongst other people,
on nuclear.
And this is the power of propaganda, of not understanding, what living in a radioactive environment is actually about. It's not just about dying. It's about having long-term illnesses that you get later, stress, dislocation, and we're about to come up on the 15th anniversary, although I don't really like that word, but of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, triple meltdown. I'll read just a little bit, so you get a flavor of the book. But I do think that I do want to move on actually to talk about cost and time, because I think there are some arguments that work better than others, and arguing about carbon footprint is not a strong argument for us, I don't think. You may disagree, I don't know, but arguing about the possibility of disaster ought to be a big Achilles heel. But when you start to talk about the costs, which are eye-watering, and how expensive electricity is going to be, and when you're talking in this country about worrying about fuel costs, we're talking about a strike price, for example, for Sizewell, if it's ever built, which is £120 a megawatt hour. I mean, it's already probably 3 times what you're already paying. So it's the most expensive way to generate electricity. But I'll just read this about Fukushima since it's coming up. The power of nuclear propaganda, propagated by the nuclear industry itself, has further obfuscated the true dangers. The industry has spent decades assuring the public that nuclear power is safe, clean, reliable, and harmless to human health. It has recruited some useful advocates, including well-known environmentalists George Monbiot and Mark Lynas. In a 2021 Guardian article, Lynas declared, "We must never forget that Fukushima has killed no one." Both appeared to believe that because no one dropped dead from radiation exposure on the day of the disaster or shortly thereafter, nuclear power is fundamentally harmless to human health. Their assertions failed to take into account that disease and death due to exposure to radiation can involve long latency periods, sometimes decades, before the effects manifest. This makes it devilishly hard to definitively tie later instances of cancers, leukemia, heart disease, kidney failure, diabetes, stroke, and other fatal illnesses to earlier exposures, such as those within the plume pathway of the Fukushima releases. Time will tell. Furthermore, since major nuclear accidents force mass evacuations, it can be harder to track the fate of people who have dispersed to new addresses. Professor Kate Brown does an excellent job of debunking the notorious undercount of deaths and diseases caused by the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster in her book, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. There is a secondary arrogance in the declaration of comfortably off white Western males pronouncing no harm about a disaster that sickened and displaced thousands, especially women and children, destroyed livelihoods and communities, broke up families, and forced people into permanent exile from their homes. The thousands of Fukushima evacuees, many of whom subsequently suffered from debilitating physical and mental after effects and even premature death, particularly among the elderly, due to stress and the upheaval of evacuation, should not be discounted as victims of the nuclear disaster. Further ignored is that the nuclear meltdowns came on the heels of a destructive earthquake and a devastating tsunami. This made the rescue of people affected by the twin natural disasters challenging, if not impossible in some areas, where the radiation levels were high. Thus, the Fukushima disaster made an already catastrophic situation even worse. And that's, I think, a lot of people forget that, the earthquake came first, then the tsunami, and that's what caused it. And it was also a deliberate cost-saving decision by TEPCO and the Japanese government not to build seawalls high enough to withstand the tsunami. So when the tsunami overtopped the seawall, it then flooded the backup generators, which were below grade. I mean, they're also stupid. So they had them in the basement, so they flooded. So they had no way to cool these reactors, and all reactors need to be constantly cooled. So it was a cascading effect. It was put down not to natural disaster, but to a collusion of government, industry, and regulator to neglectfully ignore and not take seriously what could potentially happen, and instead dismiss any possibility of that happening.
Yeah. Meanwhile, of course, the same company responsible for those power stations at Fukushima has now persuaded the Japanese government to press ahead with bringing as many reactors that were closed after that disaster back into generation. And they are now working extremely hard to get back to as many active reactors as they possibly can. And there is a new prime minister in Japan, as you have probably heard, who has now won 2 elections, the second of which with a massive landslide, despite telling Japanese electors that one of her things she would absolutely prioritize would be bringing nuclear power back to the state that it was in Japan before Fukushima. Mm-hmm. And it's quite interesting to think about this, because Japan is one of the few countries where you can't claim a link between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Because there's one pretty much certain thing, which is Japan will never develop its own nuclear weapons. I think almost all things that I used to think were certain have ceased to be certain these days. But that one I think is pretty much guaranteed. So it is a really interesting outlier for those of us who make the case all the time, and we may want to touch on this quickly, that there is an inseparable bond still between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Japan is not in that bracket, but is still now going to go hell for leather for nuclear, knowing full well what the financial implications will be, and continuing to turn its back on renewables, efficiency, storage, the whole bit about what we know the properly sustainable energy alternative looks like. So it's doubly irritating.
And I think, I hope you're right about that. I'm not sure I share your optimism, though.
About which
Japan,
bit of that?
About Japan and weapons. You'd think it'd be unconscionable for a country that had them dropped on them not to do it. But actually, they've got a massive stockpile of plutonium because of their commercial nuclear sector. And there was a minister some years ago, I'm trying to remember who it was, who bragged that, we could
Who was sacked instantly, by the way.
But never said, so many bizarre things have happened politically just in the last couple of years that anything is believable, frankly, I feel like at this point, but hopefully not that. But the inextricable link is a very important issue for this country, I think, and is also what we're seeing with the situation with Iran. So there's a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which some of the nuclear weapons countries have signed, some of them have not signed it. And then there's Israel, which officially may or may not have nuclear weapons, but they don't have to tell us, which is of course absurd. And we know they've got at least 80 and probably 200. But Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as is the United States, France, China, Britain, which has a clause in it, very inconveniently, which allows countries that say they won't develop nuclear weapons to develop what they call safe, peaceful nuclear energy. So that is their inalienable right enshrined in this treaty that they signed, which means that what they say they are doing, enriching uranium for their commercial nuclear sector, is possibly what they are doing, or not, because if you continue to enrich that uranium, you can eventually enrich it to a degree where you could transition to making nuclear weapons. So that blurry line, Iran is sort of the poster child of that blurry line between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. But what's happened is that by virtue of having a nuclear power program in that region, they have become a target. So I don't believe for a second that the reason that the US and Israel are bombing Iran is because they're worried that Iran is about to make the bomb, because they've been told categorically by their own intelligence services and by the International Atomic Energy Agency that that isn't what's happening. So this is about empire building for Israel. It's about supporting Israel's imperial designs in the region. And of course, Trump's mad imperial designs for the world, a completely reckless thing. But that's the premise. So having that possibility of transitioning from nuclear power to nuclear weapons gave them the excuse to do what they're doing instead. And it's, for me, that's a very problematic clause in that treaty, because it keeps the back door open perpetually to any country. For example, Saudi Arabia is very interested in developing nuclear power. Now, they say that they want to do it because they burn too much oil, which is bad for the climate. So we'll export the oil, and then so we've got to replace that somehow with energy for our own people. Now, what would you do if you were Saudi Arabia and you needed electricity? You would use solar energy and wind power, obviously. Cheaper, faster, safer, totally domestic, you know. I mean, when Starmer talks about domestic energy and security with nuclear, where's the uranium coming from? Are we mining it in Cumbria? No, we're not, right? It's imported from Russia and other places. So the only reason Saudi Arabia wants nuclear power is not to turn lights on, it's to have the capacity to even position themselves as having, they may never do it, but they could, if they felt like it, transition to nuclear weapons. And so it's a power play in the region. And that, to me, means you've got to shut these two things down. And I think the key premise in the book for me is that nuclear power is sort of the elephant in the room that allows nuclear weapons to continue to be developed because it provides the pathway with the materials, the technology, the know-how to do it. And it's the impediment in the room to dealing with climate change, or climate crisis is what we should call it now, because by diverting time, which we don't have any more of, and money into nuclear power, you're stripping it away from the one thing you could be investing in, which is renewable energy. Because the most important thing right now, given the time we have left, is to reduce the most carbon the fastest for the least amount of money. And so even if nuclear power was carbon-free, it's still too slow and too expensive. And so every pound, like if Jonathon and I each had a pound and he put his pound into renewable energy and I put my pound into nuclear energy, he would reduce much more carbon much faster than me. So it's a no-brainer decision in terms of what you should invest the money in to get at least somewhere towards mitigating climate change. I mean, we've left it awfully late, so I think it's going to be challenging, but you know more about this than me, I'm sure.
It is ironic to think of over the 50 years of anti-nuclear advocacy, at least the first 40 of those years were spent with the anti-nuclear movement seeking to demonstrate the connections between weapons and power. And that was what a lot of our analysis was all about, was showing that these were even then inseparable links. And it's only weirdly in the last 5 years or so that politicians have said, well, actually you were right all along. You know what, there are some pretty critical links. And our nuclear industry writ large, weapons and power, they depend on the synergies, the co-benefits that we get from bringing forward both. The reality is, of course, that by pushing forward with a lot of nuclear power, you're getting an indirect, hidden subsidy into the nuclear weapons program, which, of course, for this and every other country, and all nuclear states at the moment, by the way, are intent on massive new investments in their nuclear weapons capability. And CND calculates that for our upgrade of our Trident system will cost £205 billion, which, as you all well know, here in the UK, we do not have to spare. But now we're in a very different space because politicians are saying, of course these two things are connected. And that just proves how much we care about national security. So the truth of this industry is it can flip it any way it wants at whatever point it is dealing with sufficiently, they're not gullible politicians, but politicians who've read the story about what they think their voters really want. And their voters here in the UK, and even more so in France, do still believe we should hang on to our nuclear deterrent, and have increased in numbers since the world obviously became much less secure than it was even 10 years ago. So we're now having to deal with all of that, Linda, as much as everything else. But that's why we all come back to cost. Should we just knock off the cost story quickly? Because it is utterly staggering. It's unbelievable that any government which cared about how voters might see the sort of common sense basis of the decisions they take. It's unbelievable that we have this disparity now, which is so vast that when you actually take time out to explain it to people, they say, I don't believe that. That's just you anti-nuclear types. You know, you're just telling us that because it sounds really, really bad. But actually, we really need it anyway. And probably renewables won't do it, so we're happy to pay the extra cost.
Yeah. And the time as well. I mean, when you look at, so Hinkley C is on the Somerset coast. There are 2 huge reactors being built there by EDF. There are now, if they are actually finished by 2030, which was the new date, you were supposed to be roasting your Christmas turkeys in 2017 from the heat generated by Hinkley C. That's when the shovels first went in the ground. So this is how long it took just to get started. So it'll be 22 years late if it comes in on the 2030. The original cost for this project was £18 billion. The projected cost now is £50 billion. So that's what keeps happening. And incredibly, the UK government did an assessment of Sizewell, which is on the Suffolk coast, same thing, 2 big EDF reactors. And they say, well, we don't think there'll be any escalation of costs in this project. What? You know, have you looked at this is the cookie cutter thing. It's the same exact project. And you expect people to believe that. And this, we've learned lessons now. I mean, in fact, what's happened to nuclear power is something called negative learning, which means that even though it's a very familiar technology by now, it's getting more expensive to do and it's taking longer to come online. So negative learning, which is why it's phasing out around the world. Whereas renewable energy is coming on so fast now, it's one of the biggest job sectors, actually. And it's much bigger here, for example, even. I wrote down the numbers because I'm not going to remember them, but what I saw was in the UK, there are 690,900 full-time people employed in the renewable energy industry and 100,000 in nuclear, many of whom are old and retiring and are not going to be replaced. So it's, you know, the great betrayal to me is the sort of jobs promises, because what happens, and again, I mean, for the Welsh, it is another sort of colonialist thing, right? That will go to a part of the country that is very depressed, where young people are leaving, desperately needing jobs, and will promise them, I mean, they promised, like, I can't remember what it was, 8,000. They were going to have 8,000 jobs at Wilver. They were going to build homes for these people. Well, wait a minute. Okay, so if you're building homes, where are they coming from now? They're not coming from Wales. They're not coming from Anglesey. They're coming from the mainland, from Liverpool and elsewhere. They're coming in to do this. And so the local jobs, there'll be some in construction. That's a finite thing. There aren't a bunch of nuclear engineers sitting around in Anglesey with their sheet, frankly. I mean, they're not trained for this, so they all aren't going to get those jobs. It's a total betrayal. Apart from the fact that I always say when somebody says, oh, jobs, I say, okay, so do you want your job tomorrow or 22 years from now? Because if you choose nuclear, you might be retired by the time the job comes up, right? But if you train people into a renewable energy sector, which is growing by leaps and bounds, that is a job that is a good job that will last a lifetime. The other thing that's happening, and I think it's happening here as well as in the US, is that because there's this intense project to fast track everything, we've got to build everything in 18 months, they're cutting corners on the regulations, which is a really dangerous thing to do when you're dealing with something radioactive. And they're also increasing the doses that they're going to allow workers to be submitted to in the workplace higher than they used to be. And so they're saying, good jobs, but we're going to put your health at a greater risk than we already have been already. What happened in Fukushima, for example, was that there was an allowable, I mean, this is a big debate about there's no safe dose of exposure to radiation, but there's an allowable exposure dose, which is 1 millisievert a year. We don't have to get into all the science of what that means. But what they did was, after the disaster happened and they couldn't clean it up to that level again, they just raised it to 20 millisieverts a year, 20 times higher for everybody. And what people don't know is that women are much more susceptible to harm from radiation exposure than men. Small children, babies, fetuses, especially pregnant women, are the most vulnerable. But the radiation standards are not based on the most vulnerable. They're, at least in the US, and I'm not sure what the case is here, but it's based on a 25 to 30-year-old healthy white male. That's the person that's the most robust and who can withstand it the most. And what's good for him is good for everybody else. And so it's highly discriminatory, actually, against women. And we always tell my organization, Beyond Nuclear, we say, if you're pregnant, you should not live within 5-10 miles of a nuclear power plant, because they all release radiation routinely into the environment. And I think we were talking earlier about, the sort of, they can dismiss that they operate safely. But then you've got to start to look at the leukemia studies around nuclear power plants. Germany did them. There have been dozens since then. And what they're finding, there's one that was just done in the US, and what they're finding is elevated rates, especially amongst children, of leukemia, children 5 and under, the closer you live to a nuclear power plant. Over and over again, we're seeing those same things. And actually, the Harvard study that just came out found it amongst older people, interestingly. And so, they've always sort of dismissed that. And I feel like, okay, if you know how exposure to ionizing radiation manifests as an illness, and you've got a nuclear power plant in your neighborhood, and you're a detective, who's your prime suspect? But the burden of proof is never on the nuclear operators to say, it's not us. The burden of proof is always on the victims and their families to say it is them. And so it's very difficult, and it's taken years and years for some of these families to get any kind of, it doesn't work usually, because you've got to hire lawyers, you've got to, it takes over your life. And if you've got a child who's dying from leukemia, that's probably not your first focus. So they've got away with this for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Gloomy, isn't it?
So before we come on to the big question, and then we'll open it up a bit, the big question is, how do they still get away with it, as you've just said? We just have to deal quickly with how do they get away with the waste issue, which is completely staggering. You used the word, Linda, earlier about betrayal. Well, the story about nuclear waste is the worst intergenerational betrayal that you can possibly imagine, because we still have no long-term solutions to dealing with medium and high-level nuclear waste, much of which is made up of the spent nuclear fuel rods from reactors that have been closed and decommissioned. Finland has its geological disposal facility now, and Sweden is building one. They are monumentally expensive, but no other country at the moment has a solution to this. So you're looking at hundreds of billions of pounds of ongoing financial liabilities over the course of time, during which those spent nuclear fuel rods will need to be protected. And the basis of this is that they will be stored on site where they were used to generate the electricity, not in hard-proofed securities, but in very low-level facilities which will not be resistant to any kind of terrorist attack whatsoever. The cost alone is completely staggering, and we will happily say to all future generations, well, thanks, guys. We really enjoyed these little nuclear electrons while we were alive, and now what we're passing on to you is none of that benefit, but we're sure as hell passing on to you the full costs of this. And that, as a betrayal, intergenerational betrayal, is completely staggering. But the industry doesn't really want to talk about waste. How can this be?
Well, they have these sort of shorthand. I think, we've talked a lot about propaganda, and I feel like that is a key piece of this. Going back to Japan, for example, I just read the other day that 66% of, I think, 18 to 28-year-olds in Japan support restarting nuclear power there. Yeah. And there's young people who you'd expect to be more kind of passionately clued up. And so but Japan, from day one, from this disaster, ran a propaganda campaign to neutralize this and to try to say it wasn't really that big a deal. And they've even tried to sort of clear away the evidence. So they're discharging the liquid radioactive waste into the sea, into the Pacific Ocean from the site. Everything's in plastic bags, everything was raked off. So I think that's an incredibly important piece of this. And part of the propaganda on waste, which is sort of hilarious, actually, and I do write about this. There are some funny bits in this book. It's not all grim. I'm telling you, there's quite a lot of, and even Gary Lineker is in this book. I think that's the first time that Gary Lineker has been in a book about nuclear power. But, because of the propaganda, like what happens if you speak out and you're not supposed to be an expert on this subject, and so what happened to him is vilified over his comments on Gaza, but, there are other things he's talked about. But the propaganda on waste is, well, it will all fit in. It's nothing. It'll all fit in a football field. This is one of the size does not matter here, guys. I'm serious. If this is not about whether it'll fit in a football field, it's about what's in that football field, right? And how you would stack up these. It's not very easy to stack up fuel pellets. It all fall down. But if you went to, no one's going to play the World Cup or the Super Bowl in that football field, because if you went in it, you'd be dead in about 6 seconds. Because it's the lethality of the waste that matters, not how much of it or not there is. The other thing that they do is something called reprocessing, which is what France and what Sellafield did for years up on the Cumbria coast, which is you take the fuel that's come out of the reactors and you separate the uranium and the plutonium. Then you get a whole pile of plutonium, which is what we have in Sellafield and also La Hague in France, which is the only purpose for which is the bomb. And you also have a lot of uranium. So you create something called low-level, which is very misleading, and mid-level waste, and all of that is discharged into the air and into the sea. So that's made the Irish Sea the most radioactive sea in the world. And so they can get away with this, right? Because it's not packaged in anything. If it was in a container, it would be considered too lethal and you'd have to put it into a repository. But because they can just chuck it out into the sea. I mean, they found isotopes from Sellafield and La Hague in the Arctic Circle. So it gets everywhere. It gets into the shellfish, it gets into the lobsters, it gets, into the DNA. And and actually when you reprocess, although the idea behind it is to reduce the level of radioactivity in the waste that's come out of the reactors, they make more volume of radioactive waste during the process itself. And the other thing is that a lot of the uranium, some of it is glassified, it's called vitrification, stays on site. The rest of it, in France at least, they have no process for, so it goes to Siberia, where the Russians can deal with it. And some of it gets put back into reactors, plutonium mixed with uranium fuel, into a few of the reactors in France, to reuse. So they call it recycling. But actually what happens is that after you fission those reactors, they make more waste, and that waste can't be reprocessed. So there's no net loss at the end of this, actually, really, at all. And it's astronomically expensive, and one of the most dirty phases, along with uranium mining. And the uranium mining is the bit, I think, that people completely forget about. When we talk about domestic energy, well, first of all, Rolls-Royce the Rolls-Royce nuclear organization is all sorts of foreign entities. It's not British. It might sound terribly British, Rolls-Royce, but it isn't at all. But even so, in order to have a nuclear power plant, you need uranium, and that is not present it is. There's a chapter in here about Orkney and how they defeated the attempt to mine uranium in Orkney. There's a great citizen uprising story. But it's imported. And actually, I don't know. My understanding is that it's secret. So we actually don't know where the uranium comes from that's used in British reactors, except that we know where uranium comes from. So it's probably coming from Canada, Kazakhstan, Russia. So
we do know. There
are ways of finding.
There are official inventories.
But still, it's imported, and the kinds of reactors that, like not Rolls-Royce, but Bill Gates, right, has a design. TerraPower, great name, but it's TERRA, not RROR, which it should be. But anyway, it's TerraPower, and it's what's known as a fast reactor. And so that fuel that it has to use, the only place they make it is Russia. So Russia has this sort of special dispensation in the US as well. Like, oh, we'll ban oil, we'll ban gas, we're not going to the bad guys, but we'll take your uranium because we absolutely have to have it. You know, it's a completely hypocritical setup.
Right. So, before we come to a question, my last question to you, Linda. I mean, a bit of me sort of thinks, oh, relax. You know, this thing's going to burn itself out. Eventually people will look at the cost of this and say, what, are you completely mad? A few people will start worrying a bit more about the radiation story. Possibly there'll be another disaster because we're about due for one, by the way, just in terms of the frequency with which things do go wrong. Sod's law. It'd be really helpful if we could have another of those that didn't cause any loss of life and hopefully not too many ongoing concerns, because that would finish the nuclear industry for good. However, the weird thing is, as you said, there are a lot of young people who still think nuclear is just the bee's knees. And blow me down, it's not just George Monbiot and Mark Linus. There are quite a lot of greenies who think that nuclear power is the critical mix, the critical element in the overall decarbonisation story. And to a certain extent, they kind of go out there and they say, no, well, we care about that. The fact that we're environmentalists means that our advocacy, pro-nuclear, should count a lot more than the advocacy coming from the nuclear industry, because we've looked into all of this stuff anyway. So what, Linda, is going on in the minds of these misbegotten, ill-advised people that they still think the best thing they can add to the debate about a decarbonised energy future is as much nuclear as possible? What is going on?
Well, again, I think it's definitely a factor.
Can't just be propaganda.
It's not just the propaganda, but they haven't been confronted with the reality, I think, of, are you in favour of a just transition? Because I think that is core to the young green agenda, that we are egalitarians, we care about the global south, it's got to be fair for everybody. And so you can sort of confront that right up at the get-go, which is about uranium mining. Because as soon as you talk about, well, would you like to meet some Native Americans who've actually had to live with this for decades and who've dealt with the ongoing health challenges? Or some First Nations people in Canada, or maybe some Tuareg in Niger, who have mined the uranium for France for decades and live without clean running water and electricity and proper healthcare. They don't get any of the benefits that the rich Parisians get for switching on their lights with nuclear power. You're fine with that, are you? Because you can't argue with me about a just transition if you're willing to support that. And it's true consistently. It's actually was really fascinating researching all of this to find how the stories repeated themselves. And it was true also for the atomic testing. And I'm just going to read you a little section about that, because I really felt strongly that the most important thing for me in this book was the discriminatory, predatory nature of these twin industries on Indigenous communities and communities of colour and global south and deprived communities, those who are least resourced to fight back. That's where they've gone. For example, in the United States, they went to Western Shoshone land for the waste, Yucca Mountain, didn't happen. They went to the Goshute Indian reservation in Utah to try to dump it there, was defeated there. Then now they're going to outdoor parking lot style in a predominantly Latinx community in New Mexico. least able to fight back. That's how they do it. And the same with the atomic testing. You know, why did we bomb people so far away? Brown people so far away is because they were considered expendable, literally expendable. And it's that mindset, I think, that it's true in the weapons sector, it's true in the power sector. You can see it now with the data centers. You know, we're going to plonk these things in places where, you know, in the US, in Arizona, where people won't, you know, they'll be resourced to fight back, depriving them of their already scarce water supplies and so forth. So it's a sort of constant predatory thing. And this is a bit of a tearjerker, this bit, but I feel like it does, even though it's from a while ago, it exemplifies the mindset of this sort of the corporate predator in the nuclear sector regardless. So this is about atomic testing. I talk about uranium mining first and the different communities that have been affected, and then say, much like uranium mining, atomic testing harmed Indigenous communities who were neither warned nor protected, and most of whom have never received adequate medical treatment or compensation. That's also true for the uranium mining sector. The US left the Marshallese community on Rongelap in place for 2 days before evacuating them after the March 1, 1954 Castle Bravo test at Bikini Atoll, the biggest detonation by the US. But just 3 years later, the US moved the population back. It was a grand and callous experiment. That island is by far the most contaminated place on Earth, and it will be very interesting to get a measure of human uptake when people live in a contaminated environment, commented Merrill Eisenbud in 1956, then director of the US Atomic Energy Commission's Health and Safety Laboratory. While it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that these people are more like us than mice, he stated. So that captures the mindset. In her poem Monster, contemporary Marshallese poet and writer Kathy Jetniel Kijina describes how Marshallese women began giving birth to what they described as jellyfish babies and intestines. Sometimes I wonder if Marshallese women are the chosen ones. I wonder if someone selected us from a stack, drew us out, slow, methodical, then issued the order, give birth to nightmares, show the world what happens when the sun explodes inside you. How many stories of nuclear war are hidden in our bodies? So that's an excerpt from that poem. It's very powerful. But to me, it speaks to the whole attitude towards, you know, of the nuclear sector. It's just disregard human health, disregard safety. It's all about profit. And it's all about trying to survive, I think, you know, that because they are completely getting beaten by renewable energy, left and right, they're just trying to find a way to stay relevant. And you mentioned earlier, you know, that they always try to sort of suppress this connection between. We don't want you to know that we're connected to nuclear weapons because that might frighten people. You might think nuclear power is dangerous then. So no, these two things are totally separate. Now they can't wait to tell you how important keeping the nuclear power sector is to keep the deterrent, which you all want because you all want to have nuclear weapons to feel safe so we can blow each other to bits, you know. And the other thing that they're also saying, which is really interesting, is another argument against renewables by the nuclear sector was, well, they're intermittent. I mean, we call it variability, but they call it intermittent. So the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing, so that's it. You know, we're here all the time. So that's brilliant. But in fact, being on all the time is deeply inefficient. It means they're sending electricity to the grid when you don't need it, and they're not on all the time because they have to go down for refueling, repairs. When it's too hot, then the water gets too hot. If there's a major storm, they're off a lot. So now, I just read, the nuclear industry is trying to find a way to be intermittent. Look, we're intermittent too, you know, so that we can redesign our technology to become intermittent just like renewables. So we'll be flexible like renewables and we can come on and off the grid when needed. And, you know, so this what you talked about earlier, this kind of chop and change, chameleon-like behavior, desperately trying to stay out there, when the only way that the nuclear industry is going to survive is from subsidies, your money. That's how it's going to happen. You've got it here with a regulated asset base, which means you're going to pay in your bills even before something's built. And it's going to come out of subsidies, which they're happily handing out to build these things.
Yeah, right. Let's see if this has sparked any interest amongst people here tonight. As you can see, we hope we can answer any question.